Back on the 13th of October 2021, Demon Slayer Hinokami Chronicles was released so fans of the hit series were allowed to play their favourite Slayers or Demon in arena-style battles. Within this base game, it pretty much covered the events from Season 1 and the Mugen Train, with pretty much all major fighters being included from these arcs. Eventually, DLC was released, adding the characters from the very recent Entertainment District arc to the game, but unfortunately nothing was added to the story mode from this. It was simply just the characters, which include the newcomers Tengen, Daki, and Gyutaro, along with pretty much new skins or new movesets for Tanjiro, Zenitsu, and Inosuke. Now, of course, the next arc, the Swordsmith Village arc for Demon Slayer, was released on April 9th, 2023. However, there was no new DLC announced for the game. We waited, and then the Hashira Training arc was released and finished, and still no new announcements for Hinokami Chronicles. But on the 25th of April of this year, Demon Slayer Sweep the Board released a somewhat Mario Party type game, which not many people know, but it had the exact same developers as Hinokami Chronicles. Now, this new game came with some brand new animations never seen in Hinokami Chronicles, so it is highly likely that either a new game is being released or new DLC for the first game is coming out. So today I thought it would be fun to theorise what would be added to the game, particularly characters and arenas along with their moveset, and maybe potentially talk over what I believe will be added to the story mode, along with what new minigames can be potentially added to the expansion. And with that out of the way, let's start talking about the brand new characters that will be added to the game. These are of course the brand new characters we saw in the Swordsmith Village arc, along with the characters that were in previous arcs but didn't really have their moves fully animated. So these of course include the Mist Hashira Marichiro Tokito, the Love Hashira Mitsuri Konroji, Saname's younger brother Genya Shinizugawa. These are of course all on the Slayer side, and for the Demon side we of course have Hon Tengu and Gyoko. In terms of the older characters basically getting a new playable slot, these of course would be Tanjiro Komodo and Nezuko. I'm not really going to go into detail of those two, as pretty much I don't think the movesets have changed that much. It's just more or less I think Nezuko will be able to go out on the stages that are set in the day rather than just limited to the night, and she'll probably have more in line with the Slayer style where you can switch her out with another character rather than having the demonic based attacks that the demons do in the game. Now let's go more into detail about the character's moveset. Starting of course with the Mist Hashira Marichiro Tokito. Of course Marichiro uses a standard katana, so would have pretty much a normal range. I believe he'll probably have some form of mist effect around each one of his attacks, so you can't really tell where it's coming from, as that is the whole point of mist breathing. For his first ability, I believe it will be the fourth form of mist breathing, shifting flow slash, where of course he will take a low stance and dash towards the opponent. We best see this demonstrated against Hon Tengu at pretty much the very start of the battle before he got blasted away. For the second ability, which was more of a dashing attack anyway for most characters, I think that will be his fifth form, Sea of Clouds and Haze, which of course is where the user goes at blitzing speed towards the opponent in a zigzag motion. This would probably be very similar to Shinobu's dashing attack or Tengen's. Either way, I know these two are quite similar, but I think they'd have very different effects. For instance, the amount of mist on the fifth form could be significantly higher, meanwhile fourth form is like more low to the ground because that's where he's attacking from. And then for his third ability, I believe this should be his seventh form of mist breathing, Obscuring Cloud. Now this would work very similar to Gyu's third ability, where it is a counter move. But instead of Gyu's multiple slashes, Marichiro would essentially accelerate behind the opponent, leave a mist cloud, and then attack in a single slash from behind. Now of course you won't be able to get many combo plays off it, but it's fun to have a good counter move now and again. And of course that is the point of mist breathing, to almost misdirect the opponent and attack them from where they're least expecting, as we saw he did to Gyoko when he unleashed his attack. Now for his third attack, I think this should be his second formed 8-layered mist, where of course he releases 8 slashes in quick succession. I think that's a very good way to end the combo string. And finally for his super move, I think this should be the sixth form Lunar Dispersing Mist, where of course he leaps into the air and lets forth a multitude of slashes. Again, we saw this used to great effect against Gyoko, but I don't really see how this would work in gameplay outside of a super move, so I think that's probably the best place to use it. Now moving on to the Love Hashira Mitsuri Konroji. Of course, she doesn't use a standard issue Nichiren blade. Instead, she used a Nichiren whip, so I imagine that her range will be significantly longer than most other Slayers in the game. Now for special moves, I think her first ability should be her second form, Love Pangs, which is where the user basically performs a singular winding swing, but basically using the whipping motion in order to cut the target from multiple angles. So I think this is pretty good for first ability. Her second one is of course first form, Shivers of First Love. We saw her use this very effectively against Kyoko's fish monster, where she performs a forward dash towards it, performing a single slash, but once again, due to the fact she's using a whip, not a sword, it will hit the target from multiple areas, as we saw her basically eviscerate the pots on top of the monster and pretty much eviscerate the entire body in the meantime. And her final ability, I think, should be her sixth form, Cat-Legged Winds of Love. It's basically where she fully extends her sword, performing multiple arches and retracting and extending it, done very much in quick succession to lead to multiple slashes. So I think this is a, once again, very strong third ability. Now for her surge combo move, I think this should be the third form Cat Love Shower, which is where she will leap into the air and perform multiple arching slashes in very quick succession. Again, I think that's a very good combo ender move. And finally, for her super, I think this should be one of the most powerful moves I think we saw in the series, which was fifth form, Swaying Love Wild Claw. We saw her use it to basically just eviscerate Hakuten's wood dragons and probably eviscerate Muzan and every Hashira around her. If she had used it during the Hashira Training arc at the end, Jesus Christ, she was not holding anything back there, was she? So that pretty much wraps it up for the Love Hashira and for the Hashira that we saw in the Swordsmith Village arc. So let's move on to the new Slayer that was introduced, which is of course Salame's younger brother, Genichiro Izugawa. Now of course, because of his inability to use breathing styles, he took a very alternative ways to combat the demons, which is of course a double barrel shotgun, along with a different kind of Nichiren weapon, which I'm not going to try to pronounce, but essentially is significantly shorter than the average katana. And because of this, he could almost be a Zoner, but I don't think he would work as well as say Susumu and Yahaba work, simply due to the fact that the shotgun only takes 2 shells to load, but doesn't exceed that amount. So for that reason, I think many of his combos should start at short range, and he slowly moves back and back as he relies more on the gun after the first few initial hits. And because of that reason, I believe a lot of his special moves should revolve around the gun. For instance, his first should be just a quick shot, where Genya in quick succession fires both shots of the shotgun. His second one would of course use the Nichiren blade he has, where he draws it and dashes towards the opponent, delivering multiple slashes. Again, we saw him use this against Hantengu's clones in quite a quick succession. So now I think for his third ability, I think this should be some form of counter move where essentially, similar once again to Gyu's, he gets hit and then lets off a very powerful single shot from his gun and also slightly withdraws from the opponent in a singular motion. For a surge move, I think this should do something around his demonic transformation on the 5th hit. Maybe it allows him to use his boosted strength against the opponent in some form of crazy wrestler type move. I think in terms of a super move, it's very hard to think of one for Genya, but I think some components of it should definitely be his demonic form, along with combining some part of the repetitive action technique that we saw him teach to Tondro and use it quite effectively against Aizetsu during the Swordsmith Village arc. But again, this is quite hard to think of because again the gun has a limited amount of ammo it can use, along with Genya not having a breathing style, so it's pretty hard to come up with one for him. And we get to see a few more abilities from it during the Infinity Castle arc, which hasn't been animated yet, so yeah, it's very hard to come up with a super move for Genya. And with Genya, that covers all the Slayers that were introduced during the Swordsmith Village arc. Now let's move on to the demons from this arc, and of course start off with Upper Moon 4, Hantengu. Now given how Hantengu of course fights, I don't think he will of course be the character you actually play as during the match. I think at the start of each match, Hantengu will essentially just be a random clone, and each one would kind of have the standard range of attacks because they don't really have much differences apart from Aizetsu. You could say could have a bit more reach because of his yaoi, and of course each clone has a different blood demon art technically, so for that reason I think each one would have 2 special moves of their own, and of course the third one would be an attack that allows them to switch out to a random clone. The first clone I'm going to talk about is the anger clone Sekido, who of course is able to generate electricity, so I think that should be his first special, where he bangs his Kakara against the ground and generates an electric field, and basically certain area is off limits to the opponent for a short amount of time. And his second ability is where he takes his staff and basically impales the opponent, shocking them for a short amount of time, but it will basically dissipate after a few seconds, because otherwise this ability would be quite unfair. Next up is the pleasure clone Karaku, who of course is green and has some form of wind manipulation, so for that reason his first ability will be the wind blast we see him use against Maritra, which sends him flying, basically sways that leaf down to the ground, which generates a giant blast of wind. And of course the second ability would be kind of the same principle, but said it will be crushing the opponent rather than sending them flying. Of course, wind would only last for a few seconds and wouldn't knock them out, as we saw with Tanjiro and Nezuko. The Sadness clone is next, Aizetsu, and of course I think his will be around his Yaori, which of course would involve a spear lift, which you saw him use against Genya, and then the second ability would be the Weeping Spears, Blood Demon Art that we saw him use, which generated multiple points of it, and he thrusted it at a very, very fast pace. Then of course finally is Orogi, the Joy clone. Of course he had the Sonic Scream ability, so that will be his first special move, and for a second I think he should have some form of Talon Dash, where basically he swoops in towards the opponent and if connected deals damage with his sharp bird-like claws. Now of course for the ultimate clone, which pretty much, let's be honest, is Zohakuton, which is literally the combination of them all. I think Zohakuton should have some form of requirement before you're allowed to play him, which should basically be, number one, need to have played all clones within a match. Again, this doesn't have to be per round, but by the third round you've had to play all three of the clones, and then finally be on Sekido and basically trigger a switch, which instead of summoning another clone, will summon all three of them, absorb into Sekido, and Zohakuton will appear. In terms of special moves, these would mostly come from his dragons, but for the first one, it actually comes from him, which is a compressed sound wave, which will probably do more damage than the Sonic Blast done by Orogi. For a second, which will be Crazed Cloud Thunder Death, who came up with these names, it would of course combined Orogi's Sonic Scream with Sekido's electricity from two mouths of the dragon, dealing damage to the opponent and stunning them at the same time. And then finally is a combination between Karaku's Air Blast and Aizetsu's Spears, which I've dubbed Weeping Spears Windstorm. Honestly, I came up with that, but let's be honest, I think that could have been an actual ability we should have seen in the anime. Do kind of wish we got to see that now. But I think that is a very good third ability for Zohakuton. And of course Zohakuton, while we're having these switch that the clones will have Demon Art. So for that reason, I think one of them should be very similar to Daki's Sash, where it goes underground and ambushes, but instead that's one of the wooden dragons attacking. And the second one should be one that we saw nearly performed on Tanjiro, where he got crushed inside the dragon's mouth. Basically a dragon captures someone and then crushes inside the wood, dealing damage, but of course lets them go. It's very hard to think of a surge ability for Zohakuton, so I'm going to leave that out. But for his super, I think it should be the Countless Striking Trees move that we saw him use, which basically he strikes his drums at an increased speed where numerous of the wood dragons create a wide range of attack using all the clone's abilities, constantly dealing damage. I do also believe that the clone should have their very own super move. So the way I think this could work, essentially the clone you're playing as will start it, but then similar to say the Ninja Turtles in Injustice 2, one of them will come in and actually start the chains of attack. I think start off it should be Sekido using the electricity to stun them in place, then followed by Aizetsu using his Yaori to pick them up and launch them into the air. Orogi then takes over, clawing at them, and then should end with Karaku with a singular air crush, sending them back down to the ground. And I think that is a very good use. I know that is two super moves, but technically it is only one character using them, so I think it's pretty fair. Rather than banning a super move being used for the clones and just having it for Zohakuton. So I think this is pretty fair to make sure it's always accessible, but not just have random one dragons appear from nowhere. And now for the final demon of the Swordsmith Village arc, we of course have Upper Moon 5, Gyoko. Now, Gyoko is a bit of a weird one, as of course he's pretty much known for his vase form, but I don't think that has the best mobility in a fighting game unless they really want to go hilarious and make it so his tiny hands make the vase hop along. So for that reason, I think he's pretty much going to be in his true form throughout matches, not be something that will be unlocked as you play him. But I think most of his vase moves can still work, instead they just appear from his longer arms rather than the short stubby ones he has in his vase form. So for that reason, a lot of special moves will come from the vases, and the first one I have is his blood demon art known as Octopus Vase Hell. Where essentially he pulls out a vase and giant tentacles form from it, grabbing the opponent and probably slamming them into the ground, which could be a good way to extend combos. And of course these octopus arms would have quite good reach, so you probably use it as a combo starter as well. The next one I have would be him summoning that gigantic fish amalgamation, basically. I know it isn't very special, but hey, it's pretty cool to watch. They could attack the opponent once or twice and then disappear into the pot. They could block it, or they could destroy the pots on top of the back, but I think that's a good second move for him. And the third one is the move we saw him use against Marucho, which is his water pot prison, of course, where a vase appears, trapping the opponent temporarily. Of course, it's a fighting game, so they need to escape quicker than Marucho did. For that reason, it only lasts a couple of seconds, and it's essentially a restand type move. Not exactly a hard counter, but you can use it in combos. It won't just end the combo immediately, but probably only be able to pull off one hit with it, because otherwise it seems very unfair. Just stack these things and pretty much delete your opponent's health bar. Now for his demon art abilities, I think the first one should be the goldfish he uses, which is 1,000 Needle Fish Kill. Basically, as I said, the goldfish, he summons them and they fire poison darts at the opponent. And the second one is a move that I've come up with, which I called Eruption Vase. This basically will be Gyoko summons a pot into the ground and a jet of water comes up and it can block the opponent. Again, very similar to Daki's belt. For his surge, I think that should be his Killer Fish Scales. This was seen in his true form, where he delivers a wide barrage of physical attacks at a very high speed. Of course, due to his scales, he pretty much has flexibility to go wherever he wants, but of course this would be the end of combo move and just deliver very, very fast punches and strikes that we saw him very much miss against Marucho. And finally, I think his super should be the final base attack that we saw him use, which was 10,000 Gliding Slime Fish. This, of course, where he summons multiple pots. I think they can kind of make him line up on his body or something. I don't really know. And he summons a bunch of, slime fish, which of course devour the opponent, leaving nothing but the bone left, or that's what he said. But of course, this is the super move, so it should be something powerful. But I don't think it should be that powerful. Essentially, they bite and at the opponent and then swarm off and leave. It's either that they can release the poison, have a little bit of an active effect if it's not the final move, but hey, they can have some fun with it in my opinion. And yeah, that is all for the Swordsmith Village arc in terms of playable characters that I would add to the roster. Now moving to the most recent arc of the anime, we of course have the Hashira Training arc. Now this one unfortunately is going to see a significant drop in the amount of characters. This is because we only really saw one fight in the entirety of this season, and that was of course Obanai and Sodomy versus the horde of demons in the castle. So for that reason, the characters are going to have to take a significant reduce when compared to the Swordsmith Village and most other arcs before it, as pretty much only Sodomy used enough breathing techniques that I think a unique character can come from him, as Obanai only used 2 techniques, and that's pretty difficult to come up with some new forms for. I know they're all in the manga, but I think the people making this game would much prefer to see them in motion rather than going off 1 or 2 drawings. And then of course Guillaume was only shown having 1 technique of stone breathing, so I think for that reason only Sonome would make it into the game as of currently. Let's of course gotta wait till the Sunrise Countdown arc comes out, in which case add everyone at once, but if we're going to make a new game now based on what we got, it will only be Sonomy. So let's talk about him. He uses a standard Nichiren katana, so for that reason he will obviously have the very standard range that most other characters have. And in terms of special move, the first one is his second form, Claw's Purifying Wind, where of course he lifts the sword over his right side and deals 4 vertical slashes resembling claws. This could do pretty good high amount of damage and could again lead quite well into a lot of combo moves. His second would of course be the dashing move, which would be his first form, Dust Whirlwind Cutter. We saw him use this against Gyu and it was a great way to close in distance. But he literally dashes towards the opponent at speed, creating a cyclone pattern as he gets closer. And the final special move would be his fifth form, Cold Mountain Winds, where of course he creates several circular slashes. Again, we saw him use this against Gyu. I imagine this is a pretty good third ability, it seems pretty powerful. His surge is pretty hard, as unfortunately we haven't seen enough of the wind breathing forms to make one, so I think it should be those rapid slashes that he did against the demon in the castle. Seem pretty good for a surge ability, they deal multiple hits. And for his super move, I think that should be his fourth form, Rising Dust Storm, where as we saw, he literally created a gigantic whirlwind around him, dealing multiple hits of damage on the opponent. Kind of work a little bit similar to Rengoku's super, for example, even though that's obviously a bit better in the anime. Now, with all the characters wrapped up, let's move on to the story mode features that I would add. Now, as I said earlier, in the DLC for the Entertainment District, there wasn't really any story mode added to it for some reason. So let's of course review that, and I think the first kind of mini games of this should be the Komaboku squad trying to blend into the Entertainment District, where of course you do fortunately work for the houses. Zetsu would of course play that instrument. Inosuke would try and get information on what happened to Makio, Uzui's wife, and of course Tanjiro would be doing the chores. I don't think that should be added, but could be ironic. And of course a lot of cutscenes will play out until you get to the first fight, which I think should be Inosuke versus the Worm Bout. Basically you deplete his health bar, then you move on to the second round of this fight, which would be Inosuke and Zenitsu versus the Worm Bout, in which of course Tengen will arrive into the cavern, destroying the belt entirely, and of course that's that match finished. Next up would of course be Tanjiro versus Daki with her black hair. This is before the belt reapplied to her. I think this does kind of carry out the motif of the Entertainment District. It makes sense to do it in that order. Then of course it will transition to a fight with Daki on the roofs of the Entertainment District, and of course she will gain her more signature white hair as she becomes more complete. Now you do that once again until her health's depleted, in which case I think it could actually be interesting if they do a quick time event. But of course you fail because in the show Tanjiro didn't cut off Daki's head because he needed to breathe. Now you think you failed until a new prompt comes in, and in which case it's Nezuko's absolute devastating kick of Daki that sent her flying. This would, with a cutscene as well, neatly transition into Nezuko versus Daki back on the streets of a district, defeat her, get her to a certain point, and of course Tengen eventually comes in, slashes off Daki's head, in which case Gyutaro is summoned, so in which case you get your first fight against Gyutaro, which will combine Tengen and Tanjiro, and Daki would not really be a switch-outable character, but her belt will interfere with some of your movements, so you've got to keep an eye out for that. A very good way to use these two. Ultimately you get, then it will switch to Tanjiro, Inosuke and Zenitsu doing a quick time event, getting off Inosuke's Palace Bite off on Daki, which of course will lead to the final fight after a bunch of cutscenes, which is where it will be Tengen and Tanjiro versus Gyutaro, which will lead to a quick time event of both of their deaths at the same time. Now of course there is one thing I would change about this, and that is the fact I think Tengen should lose his arm after you've completed this battle. I think just because it's quite hard to try and animate a whole new character, given the fact he loses, his entire left hand, so it's quite hard to reanimate the sword only going to his right. That's a pretty difficult thing to do, so for that reason I think like any massive explosions that will happen all the way up to Tanjiro cutting off Gyutaro's head, similar to how he lost one of his blades and his eye, Gyutaro should take out one of his hands then, rather than when he did earlier in the fight in the actual official show. This is just so they don't have to spend time trying to re-hit Tengen's swords or having the left one float in midair somehow, which will be kind of interesting. And moving on to the second arc, which is the Swordsmith Village arc, which I think should start with Tanjiro versus the Yoriichi Type 0. Again, pretty good fight, and it's how you probably get the sword for later, so it makes sense to show it. Next will be a quick time event of Tanjiro and Orogi getting back into the fight with Hantengu's clones, in which case actual fight start, which I think should start with Tanjiro and Nezuko versus Sekito and Karaku. Next would be Genya versus Aizetsu, and of course probably either after the Tanjiro Nezuko fight we should have him performing the triple decapitation he does against the three clones. Honestly, that scene animated is just great. I really want to see it in like a 3D CGI way, it'd be cool. And as we saw in the anime, Genya had decapitated Aizetsu as Tanjiro decapitated the other three. So for that reason, I think that the quick time event should wait again until you fought Aizetsu as Genya. That way it kind of flows a bit better, you can kind of get the implication right, and therefore, all the clones have been fought by the Slayers before they converge into Sohokuton. Then you switch into Morichiro versus Gyoko. Now, the initial fight, I think, should be against one of his fish creations. Pretty quick fight, honestly, resulting in the pots being destroyed. Then you move on to the actual fight against Gyoko, which will first start with his pot form. Once he's defeated that, he will switch into his true form after, and this will result in a quick time event which will result in his head being sliced off and Gyoko defeated. Then would be Mitsuri vs Hokuton, and then of course it will wrap up with Tanjiro and Nezuko versus the final clone of Hontengu, which is Arumi. This would lead to the clearing, where once again you get a quick time event to destroy the final clone here. Now this would result in a cutscene where the sun starts to rise, Arumi and Nezuko's bodies start to burn within it, resulting in Nezuko's sacrifice and eventually Tanjiro being able to permanently put down Hontengu by slashing straight through Arumi. Now I think this could also play out as a quick time event. That would be a lot of fun to play out rather than just having to sit down and watch it. So I think they could actually, that'd be a lot of fun. Then of course this results in the final cutscene of this arc with the celebration that the Swordsmith Village has survived in a way, or at least the people have survived, but the village is destroyed, and the celebration that we saw at the end of that arc, along with seeing Muzan's plans for the future, along with his more from his child self into his mature self on screen in a CGI manner again, could be incredibly cool to see in this manner of animation rather than the 2D style that we see, obviously. And of course, for the most recent arc again, the Hashira Training arc, once again this didn't have too many fights. I think this one would kind of work a bit like the Butterfly Mansion, where you get to play a bunch of mini games against the Hashira. For instance, Morichiro working on the timing of your strikes, Obanai working on your accuracy, Mitsui flexibility. Basically just go watch the arc if you want a good idea of how this is going to look. And that wraps it up with the story. Pretty short, which is why I get why they haven't done it yet, or just released the Entertainment District. I get why. Unfortunately, those arcs are pretty much gigantic battle scenes, so you could get a lot of playability, but it's quite a lot of cutscenes as well at the start. And finally, moving on to the stages. For the Entertainment District, I think they should add the Cavern Underground along with the Destroyed District. It pretty much already has a stage as well where it's absolutely fine, so for that reason, the Destroyed District and Cavern Underground is all we need. For the Swordsmith Village arc, I think having the actual village centre would be a good map, along with Haganeska's hut. That would be a pretty good place to have a fight. And then finally the clearing where Nezuko becomes immune to sunlight. And for the Hashira Training arc, I think the Restoration Castle should be a pretty good place to have a good fight, either the inside of it or maybe on the roofs, which could be pretty difficult but also a lot of fun. The different Hashira's mansions, I think particularly the inside of Morichiro's and possibly the grounds of Sodomies would be pretty good, along with the training grounds that we saw, where the Hashira went to train at night with each other. That would be a pretty good stage to fight at. And finally, the Destroyed Master's Mansion as a final stage would also be pretty good for this game. And of course, finally, let's talk about some new skins that could be added kind of hard, because again, they don't really change that much, or they've already been added. Like again, Tanjiro, we know skins, and Izu already have skins for the Entertainment District. Tengen doesn't really change much for that, but I think having his retired look, but again with both hands, would be quite a good skin for him to have, along with him just casually having his hair down, as we saw in the district. That would be a pretty good skin to have for him, just his hair down and in that more casual robe. I think for Mitsuri, her outfit would just be her with no Haori and maybe the Demon Slayer mark. But for Morichiro, it's a bit harder because he doesn't really have an outfit changed, and I'm not sure whether it would be worth just adding in the Demon Slayer mark. Could be, I think that would show a bit of dedication, but how often are you going to see his Slayer markings? But again, I think they should if they want to, but don't have to. For Daki, as I kind of previously mentioned, she should have her black-haired look along with her white hair. I think they kind of missed out on not adding that in the first place. Yutaka doesn't really have any outfit changes, neither do any of the other demons. I think Tanjiro maybe not having his Haori injured by the different demons could also be a good skin. And Genya, again, doesn't really have many outfit changes. He just goes into his demon form, which I kind of said would be his surge move. So, yeah, there are that many skins I could see added, but they could add a handful. So, and with that, I think that's pretty much everything I could come up with for this game so far. Whether they release an entirely new game when the anime is finished, or whether they just release a small DLC now before the anime finishes, is completely up to them. I don't know the future here, so for that reason, I think we could be in for a very interesting time with this game. With that, that's all I could personally think of. What do you guys think? What would you like to see added to this game? Let me know in the comment section down below, and while you're down there, if you want to, leave a like if you want to see me again, subscribe, and with that, goodbye.